Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Ankur Desai. Today I'm joined by our climate editor, Justin Rowlatt. Justin, it's always great to have you on, but we are talking about something which is quite concerning, the wildfires which are spreading across Europe. Just describe the scope of them and how vast they are.
Uncle, these are really big fires. So the Spanish authorities say these fires are 6 times bigger than the fires they experienced last year. Typically, across the whole of the fire season, which starts in June, ends about the end of September, across the whole of the fire season, on average, Spain would see 100,000 hectares burnt. They've already had 130,000 hectares burnt. So these are already bigger than the annual average. And in France, similarly, this is way bigger than they've seen before. Started earlier, burning more extensively, and also, burning a lot hotter than they expect these fires to burn.
And the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez, he's talked about this being a climate emergency. How big an emergency is this? Because it feels like every time there is a spread of wildfire, it becomes more and more dangerous, I guess.
Well, the emergency comes because climate change, as we know, is making summers and springs hotter and drier. And obviously, high temperatures and low rainfall create the conditions, that allow these fires to burn and burn extensively. But it's also combined, actually, interestingly, with the quite wet winter. Now, that isn't necessarily a climate issue because rainfall varies quite dramatically year to year. But the wet winter allowed lots of vegetation to grow. Then when we had a very dry spring, very dry summer, the vegetation dries out. You've got loads of fuel, loads of tinder. So when a spark comes and lights a fire, there's much more fuel to burn. And that's why we're seeing such hot fires with these extraordinary kind of meteorological phenomena, these pyrocumulonimbus clouds, these fire-driven thunder clouds that are rising above some of the fires, literally creating their own weather. So they draw in huge amounts of air as the plume of smoke rises into the high atmosphere. So create these unpredictable winds, often dramatic downdrafts, which can change the direction of the fire, fan the flames, but also lightning, which can spark even new blazes. And then sometimes, it can be beneficial. You get some rain, but often the fire's so hot, the rain actually evaporates before it hits the ground. So really we're seeing some really unusual, really dramatic things. These are the kind of things that you typically see in wildfires in Canada or in America, those huge wildfires. You get over there and you see these thunderclouds formed by the fire. Very unusual in Europe, and again, an indication just of how exceptional this fire season is.
And something else I've heard you talk a lot about as well, the accumulated vegetation and the abandoned land, which can also provide fuel to these fires.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Spain and France both have seen this kind of exodus from rural areas as agricultural techniques have changed and the jobs have drawn people in. So as older people die, they've been leaving the countryside, and that means there's a lot of kind of abandoned land, as you say, and often that turns to scrub, and scrub, which, as I say, can dry out quite easily, then becomes tinder, becomes fuel for fires. So another reason, it's kind of the management of our landscapes, that needs to be addressed if we're going to begin to tackle that, cutting fire breaks in exactly those kind of conditions, which, dry scrub, one spark, and, you can have a huge conflagration.
I guess, Justin, what can we do now to help prevent these fires becoming a regular occurrence going forward? It feels as though local officials talk about forest management, they talk about planting different types of trees. What are some of the methods, I guess, we all need to think about now going forward?
Well, we've talked a bit about that fuel accumulating and, these forest management methods that you're talking about often are about reducing that. And there are quite interesting things they can do. For example, putting big kind of grazing animals in there to eat it, goats maybe, cows. Back in the old days, you'd have aurochs, these huge kind of buffaloes that would be in the, in the thousands of years ago in the forest. So maybe bringing some of those animals back to reduce the amount of scrub and grasses and brush there is there. And also they're talking about controlled burn, something we do see in other forest areas. Again, in North America and in Canada, you sometimes see that. So in kind of dry seasons when the ground's quite wet, so it's quite controllable, you can burn some of that brush away, and that can means there's less fuel for the fires. But it's something else rather more dramatic that they're talking about doing, not just in Spain and France, but as far north as the UK and into Scandinavia, is cutting fire breaks. Again, something you see quite commonly in places like Canada, but big fire breaks, which means that break the forest and allow an opportunity for the fire services to get in and kind of control the fire. It doesn't immediately jump to the next trees. So that's something we may be seeing, and that may really change the way that our natural environment looks. You know, the wild spaces, the national parks that we've got may have these rather brutal kind of lines cut through them in order to prevent, well, frankly, to prevent the whole lot going up in flames in the future, because as the climate continues to warm, we can expect even drier summers and therefore, you know, even more kind of fire susceptible landscapes.
Justin, with your experience, when you watch the coverage, what do you think we're missing? What do you think sometimes we need to be more aware of, and sometimes it sort of goes under the radar? Things which frustrate you that we maybe need to be talking about more or be aware of?
Well, I have to say, when you look at the footage, is so dramatic, isn't it? You know, it looks, you know, apocalyptic.
Yeah,
you
it's
know,
quite terrifying.
So it's terrifying, and I think it should serve as a reminder to us all of the kind of consequences of allowing climate change to continue to drive temperatures up. I think the other thing, sometimes people look at these things and think, well, that's an issue for Spain and France, when they should really be thinking, how is climate change going to change? You know, if you don't live in Spain and France, you live elsewhere, maybe in a more northerly latitude, thinking, well, this is something that could come our way, and maybe we should be beginning to think about how we change the way we manage our landscapes to stop this happening when we get similarly hot, dry springs and summers.
Do you sense there will be more political will to do something about this a lot quicker, be more proactive in terms of taking action and dealing with climate change? Are the leaders now going to have to now sit down together, a lot of them, like you mentioned, from countries which may not be typically affected by wildfires, but everybody needs to now have a better consensus in terms of how to tackle this going forward?
Well, we've often said that the way to tackle climate change is for countries to get together. You know, a few years back, there was pretty broad global consensus that climate change was an important issue to tackle collectively as a world community. That has kind of evaporated a bit, partly driven by the President of the United States, who's quite sceptical about climate change and the requirement to tackle it. So that's kind of weakened that global consensus. But, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? You see the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez saying this is evidence of a climate emergency. And I think, you know, as we said, you look at the pictures, it certainly looks like a very dramatic emergency situation. And, you know, one hopes that for people who want action on climate change, this will stimulate leaders to say, this is something, you know, I don't want to have to be explaining to my electorate why we didn't begin to tackle this issue sooner. So hopefully there will be an impetus to, you know, become more ambitious in tackling climate change.
And just finally, I guess us as human beings, as a society, a world, global society, well, what could we be doing more, and what sort of conversations do we need to be having amongst ourselves, even with our family members across the dinner table, perhaps?
Well, it comes down to the requirement to ultimately tackle the source of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions. We need to reduce those. I mean, the good news is that globally we appear to be reaching kind of peak CO2 emissions, partly because machines and stuff are getting more efficient, partly because we're using more renewable energy. That is good news. But remember that the carbon dioxide we put in the atmosphere stays there for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. So there's a stock of it up there. We've got to stop adding to that stock. So it's okay. It's great that we're plateauing our emissions, but really we need to drive them down more dramatically. So we should all be thinking about how we can kind of reduce our emissions, you know, maybe fly a bit less, use the car a bit less, public transport, maybe eat a bit less meat, which is associated with methane, which is another greenhouse gas. So there are all those things, the familiar things, frankly, that we can do that we should be concerned about. And the other thing, of course, is if you're worried about climate change, you know, articulate that concern, speak out about it, write to your, you know, your member of parliament, your local political representative, and say, this is something I care about and I want to know what you're doing about it. That will raise the priority in their mind and hopefully help them recognise this is a challenge that they should address and begin to tackle. So I think those are all ways that we can get involved and the kind of conversations we need to have with each other.
Justin Rowlatt there, our climate editor. That's all from us for now. If you want more content from the Global News Podcast, click on the link below. For now, thanks so much for your company, and I'll see you on the next one.